Good morning and welcome to the Point. Presidential politics in Michigan this week had former President Bill Clinton in Flint and Saginaw stumping for his wife, Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton. And the man who once tried to stop that nomination, Senator Bernie Sanders, was in Grand Rapids, urging his supporters now to back Clinton. Senator, you were able to win in Michigan in the primary here, and you attracted a lot of enthusiasm, and a lot of that enthusiasm came from young people. And we know that in this election cycle, those same young voters are going to be important for Secretary Clinton. How do you help convert those voters?
Well, I think I would ask young people and all voters to take a hard look at the agenda that Secretary Clinton is bringing forth. She is talking about a proposal that I work with her on to make public colleges and universities tuition free, which will be of huge help to thousands and thousands of families in Michigan, raising the minimum wage to a living wage, pay equity for women, the understanding that climate change is real and we have to protect the planet for our children and our grandchildren. I think if you look at her record and you compare it to Donald Trump's, I think the evidence is overwhelming that her record is far superior for working families than Mr. Trump's.
I watched you in Philadelphia, and I watched the platform committee that put together the ideas that the Democrats are guided by. And there's a lot of Bernie Sanders in that platform, it appears to me. So, understanding that it's disappointing not to finish the quest that you started on, are you satisfied that a lot of what you talked about on the campaign trail is now part of that platform?
I am. It is by far the most progressive platform in the history of American politics. It talks about Wall Street's greed and breaking up the large banks. It talks about transforming our energy system. It talks about raising the minimum wage to a living wage. It talks about health care for all people. It talks about what we have to do to protect a middle class which today is in a lot of trouble. And I was glad that we could work with Secretary Clinton in getting that platform completed. But a platform is one thing, getting it implemented is something else. And what I will do the day after the election, hopefully with Secretary Clinton winning, is to make sure that we start implementing that platform.
What do you make of this political cycle? You obviously watched from your primary race and the Republicans' primary feuds, but there is a polarization, it appears, in the electorate that is very deep. What can you do about that?
I think we could do a lot about it. I think there are a lot of angry people in Michigan, in Vermont, all over this country, and they have a reason to be angry. In many cases, they're working longer hours for low wages. They're worried to death about their children and what kind of jobs or education their kids are going to be able to have. And what we have got to say to those people, we hear you, and we are going to create a nation which addresses your concerns. We're going to create the jobs that your young people need and make sure that your kids can get to college without going deeply into debt. We're going to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. We're not going to allow large multinational corporations to shut down in Michigan or Vermont and move to China or Mexico and throw you out on the streets. There are a lot of things that we have got to do. But at the end of the day, what we have got to do is have the courage to stand up to the 1%, stand up to the billionaire class, and tell them, this country doesn't belong to them. It belongs to all of us. That is what we have got to do as a people.
Finally, Senator, we don't know what the outcome will be when you go back to the Senate in January, but it is likely to be a much more narrow split one way or the other. And it's probably going to be more narrow in the House. Does that make it easier or more difficult to get things done?
For me, I think it will be easier. Look, I understand that there's a lot of dysfunction in the Congress. But at the end of the day, what we need is a Congress that listens to the needs of the American people, not to billionaire campaign contributors. And one of the areas where I strongly agree with Secretary Clinton is we have to overturn this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which allows billionaires to buy elections. That's not democracy. That is oligarchy. So what I will fight for is to make sure that Congress listens to the struggling middle class, listens to the young people, listens to the senior citizens, not listen to billionaire campaign contributors who want more tax breaks for the rich. So that's really what the struggle is about.
And there are more visits on the way. We'll talk about that at the end of this program. But up next, Senator Gary Peters sits down to talk about legislative opportunities, some of what he's been doing this summer. It's next, To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. Senator Gary Peters came by this week to talk about some of what he is up to legislatively and to talk about some initiatives that he has undertaken. Senator, let's start with something that happened recently, and I will make an assessment of it and then you can tell me. The Water Resources Development Act ultimately was changed to include some money for Flint. That money, some people had wanted included in the continuing resolution. And there was talk among some of my colleagues about a shutdown. I suggest that a shutdown was never in the works. It's an election year. Democrats don't want it. Republicans don't want it. And this agreement was worked out primarily because nobody wanted to shut down government. But it did get into the WARDA reauthorization. Was that a good solution?
Well, it keeps the discussion going. We're not there yet, and that was our concern. The continuing resolution would have funded the work in Flint immediately. As you know, the continuing resolution did have money for flood victims in Louisiana, and I fully supported that. But I also thought if folks in Louisiana were getting help, then certainly we needed to make sure we're helping people in Flint, Michigan as well. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. We had a WARDA bill that passed in the Senate that Senator Stabenow and I worked on that provides funding. It's fully funded. It got 95 votes in the Senate as well. It was broad bipartisan support. We had an impasse in the House. Now there is some language in the House, but it's different than what we passed in the Senate. So it'll go to conference committee in the lame duck session, and then we'll have to keep working it. So at least we have a path, but it's not over yet.
Let me ask you about that, and I don't want to get too far off in politics, but lame duck sessions, I think more at the state level because sometimes they get completely chaotic. But at the federal level, this cycle, this could be very interesting because the control of the Senate may change. The numbers in the House certainly will change, though control, we don't know. So the lame duck, depending on the outcome of this election, could be a place where people make some real political statements. Does that impact this agreement, you think?
Well, and that's what I'm concerned about because you don't know. We don't know. It depends on who wins the presidency, and as you mentioned with the Senate and the House, the dynamics you could play that out on a chessboard a lot of different ways. And I don't want WARDA to be taken off that chessboard. So that's my concern. We have certainly worked to get the assurances of a lot of folks that we will actually take up that bill. And it's a bill important for Flint, but it's also a bill important for water infrastructure projects across the country. In Michigan here, it has money for dredging and harbor improvements, the Port of Muskegon, other things happening here on the west side of the state. So the WARDA bill is very important. So we hope it comes up, it doesn't get lost in that shuffle. And that's another reason why we wanted it in the CR, because we would have known it's done and appropriated, and now there's still some uncertainty. But we're going to be working pretty aggressively to keep it in there.
Continuing resolution takes us for, was it 10 weeks?
Through into December. So we'll be back at it in December, which will also take up a lot of floor time. It'll also be a big part of the lame duck as well. So that's a concern as to whether or not the WARDA bill is even brought up. But again, we're going to work very aggressively to make sure that happens.
Do we ever get back to a point where we do budgets in the normal order that was once established, that was done for decades? Do we ever get there?
We better get there. It's a source of constant frustration that we don't have regular order, where we're putting forward budgets and talking about the priorities of the country. That's what this whole process is about, is that if you want to look at someone's priorities, just look at where they're spending money, and you do that through the budget process where you can have a full and comprehensive debate, as opposed to just continuing resolutions that just continue the status quo and they throw a few other items on, and we could see that in an omnibus as well. It's not the way to run a government, so we've got to be able to get back to the regular order.
Let's talk a little bit about something that is less political in nature and probably much more Michigan-centric, although it's going to impact everybody and globally, quite frankly, and that is autonomous vehicles. You and I were talking just before we started that I recently had an opportunity to go down to M-City. I know you have visited and have been very involved in this process, but I was taken by how far along we really are. I mean, when you talk about autonomous vehicles, I think people immediately think about self-driving cars, and that's not necessarily that will happen at some juncture, but it might not be for everybody. It's connected cars, cars that can talk, cars that have the ability to do things for you, and all different variations of that. Tell me about where you think we are, and let's talk a little bit about the proposal to take Willow Run, which is about 10 times bigger than M-City, and turn it into a more development type place.
Well, it is. This is an incredibly exciting space in the auto sector. In fact, if you think about the transformational nature of what we're seeing with connected vehicles and eventually self-driving vehicles, it's probably the biggest thing to happen to the auto industry since Henry Ford had the first car come off of the assembly line. I mean, it is that big, it's that transformational. And that's why I'm certainly working very aggressively to make sure it stays in Michigan, because there are a lot of other places that think they can do this. Think Silicon Valley and California because of the computer applications and sensors involved. But we've got to keep it here. We are already a leader in that area. You went to M-City, which is part of the University of Michigan, which is a world leader in the area. It's a test track that is studying all of these technologies. But we have to get to the next generation, which is the Willow Run facility, which is in Ypsilanti. We're looking to get that designated as a national testing facility, much larger. It's 300 plus acres versus the 30 acres at M-City. And it's where we have to go. And other areas, in Asia and Europe, they have these sites already. We also want to be a leader, not just in Michigan, but in the world, to make sure that we are the leader in that technology. And it really represents a real business model change for a lot of auto companies as well. Because in the past, you'd have a proving ground. Every company had their own proving ground, and they'd work to have a competitive advantage.
And they were guarded, and you
They're all
couldn't get in, you couldn't see anything.
Couldn't see anything, and those were secrets that were important for the company. But now when you have everything connected, and they only work when they're connected, you have to have a GM has to talk to a Toyota, and a Toyota has to talk to a Ford, and all of our cars are going to be talking to each other. And when they are able to do that, I mean, we think just in the short run, in the next few years, the belief is that we can eliminate 80% of all car crashes in this country can be eliminated with technologies that are coming online now. And when you consider that nearly 40,000 people die on our highways every year, not to mention the people who get injured, to eliminate 80% of car crashes is phenomenal. And then when you get to fully self-driving vehicles, that number could go to near zero. So it is pretty exciting stuff.
I want to go back to something you were talking about, because I was taken by the fact that all of those companies are on that track at M-City. They're all working together, and it's not just auto companies. You walk in and there is this, along one of the fences, all the people who sponsor M-City, and it's everybody who's anybody in automotive production or even
insurance.
Yeah, banking, and everybody that is behind this thing. That really is something different to hear them all trying to work together, while still no doubt trying to get a competitive advantage, but they have to have, as you say, the same language, right? So that's what they're working on.
They are. They got all these systems have to work together, and so there's a little bit of more of a sharing model than what we've seen in the past, especially with the connected aspects of it. But as you mentioned, the different signs, I brought up insurance because you think about insurance, especially when you get to self-driving cars. Right now, the whole insurance model is based on a driver, and someone's at fault for that accident, unless there's a mechanical failure of some sort. But what if you take the driver out of the equation? Then what do you do about liability? Who assumes that liability? I mean, there are a lot of significant public policy issues that are associated with this transformation we're seeing in mobility.
Well, sure. I mean, because if you have a self-driving car and there's a crash, is it the auto company that then has the liability? And obviously they don't want to assume that. So this will change a lot in the financial services sector and insurance going forward. Let's talk about something that I know you're passionate about, and something that you have real life experience with from your military experience, and that's national security. You had a CODEL earlier this year that looked into some of those issues. Tell me about your trip and tell me what you were trying to explore.
Well, we were looking at various aspects. One was terrorism, so we were in Morocco related to terrorism in North Africa, and the fact that Morocco is a stable country, has been able to stand up to ISIS and other threats, which is important that we continue to have our strong relationship. But then we spent time in the Ukraine and Estonia, Iceland, to talk about NATO and the threat, and in particular the Russian threat, which of course is significant in the Ukraine, where you have the Russians that have taken over Crimea in an illegal operation there. As we were in Ukraine, Russian soldiers were killing Ukrainians on the eastern front there. And to make sure that we still have strong relations with Ukraine, they certainly want America to be there with them and are very concerned about that. And with the increased aggression that we're seeing from Mr. Putin and the Russians, that also has folks in Estonia, for example, extremely concerned in the Baltic states. Here we are in a small country which was under Soviet domination before their independence. We had Nazi domination as well. They're a short distance from the Russian border. The Russians could be in their capital city in probably an hour and a half, 2 hours. It would have the whole country, could take it over in less than a day. And they're very concerned about U.S. presence in Europe and the strength of NATO, given what we're seeing as increased Russian aggression.
If I understand this, we did some troop deployments into the region, but we don't really have assets there. In other words, they were intense, kind of along some of these borders. So how are we positioned to respond to a Russian threat that seems to be ongoing, if not escalating?
I think we have to step it up. It has been cut back dramatically as a result of the Cold War ending and having an excess of 300,000 troops down to probably 30,000 U.S. troops, so mostly in Poland right now. We have the National Guard, and actually the Michigan National Guard is in Latvia. I had the opportunity to meet some folks from the Guard who were there, who came up to Estonia to see me. We have different National Guards that are in those countries. In Estonia, where I was the National Guard of Maryland, for example. And they do important training missions and our presence, but those countries would like to see more Americans there. They want to see the U.S. Flag flying because they believe that having U.S. troop presence in their countries is a significant deterrent for the Russians to come in if they know that there are U.S. troops there.
Do we have that capability? I mean, you talk about how many troops have been drawn down over the course of time, and people would say, well, that's a cost-effective measure and the Cold War is over. But Vladimir Putin has shown his willingness to thumb his nose at the United States at almost every level. Mm-hmm. Even if we had more troops in there, is that really a deterrent, or is he confident in his country's power to expand if that's what they decide to do?
Well, I think it would be a deterrent. Now, the question is how you put that force structure together and have folks now in Estonia, where I was, the UK has a presence there. So different members of NATO have taken different places, the Canadians, the UK, the United States. We are in Poland, for example, is where our troop presence. But there are ways to have a presence in addition to just having troops, too. It's some of the technology, air defense systems, for example. When I was in Estonia, they were very concerned that if you had a Russian attack and they brought in troops via helicopter and transports, there really wasn't a air defense system sufficient to protect them, and they would like some U.S. resources to help them with that. And that, I think, is a significant deterrent, because then the cost-benefit analysis that anybody has to go through, and certainly Mr. Putin has to go through that as well, if you increase the cost aspect of it, you end up saving money, because a conflict would be far in excess, and not only in financial cost, but certainly the human life cost as well. So the best thing is to prevent any kind of belief that you can take a country real quick and suffer no repercussions for it. If he thinks that's the case, cost-benefit equation is completely different, and we can't allow that.
On another front, we're still dealing with a significant refugee problem, particularly Syrian and other Middle East populations, and the United States is struggling with how to deal with those refugees. We talked about it the last time you were here. Since then, Texas has said, we're not going to do this. We are not going to participate. Other governors have expressed their unwillingness, though haven't as formally said they aren't going to. What is our role as the United States? What should we be doing about these refugees? And how do you get people on board who have fears that may or may not be in actuality what is out there, but if that's their perception, perception becomes reality for people?
Yeah, and I understand concerns, and that's why we have to make sure that folks understand that if refugees do come here, they go through an intensive screening process, well in excess of 18 months. They have to go through a UN screening to be identified as a refugee in the first part, and then it's up to a country whether or not they would accept individuals. And then we have the Department of Homeland Security, we have the FBI, you have the Department of Defense. I mean, it's an intense screening process. In fact, the most difficult way to come to the United States is through the refugee program. I mean, there are other ways that would be easier for someone to come into our country, and we have to tighten those loopholes. And that's something that I work on a regular basis as a member of the Homeland Security Committee. Visa waivers, other types of programs that I really am more concerned about that we need to focus on. But ultimately, I mean, the solution really is to stabilize Syria and have folks so they're not fleeing the country. And that's not an easy solution. And we're seeing what's happening in Aleppo. It's got the world's attention. We are making advances against ISIS, and U.S. has been working with Iraqi forces, for example, in moving ISIS out and constraining their ability to take territory in that areas. But ultimately, you've got to stabilize that region. And I think I may have mentioned this when I was on your program before. I was at a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan, one of the largest camps, over 80,000 people there, met with Syrian refugees. And I asked them, I said, where do you see yourself in the next few years? Where do you want to go somewhere? Where do you want to be? And every single one had the same answer. They just want to go home. They don't want to go to Europe. They don't want to go to the United States. They want to go home. Just like if anybody asked us that, we wouldn't want to leave. We'd want to stay in our country and with our families and go back. We have to stabilize the region in order to allow folks to be able to do that.
And I don't want to get bogged down in this either, but briefly, I mean, simply enough said, but that is a
Huge
lift.
Huge lift, and it's not going to happen overnight. So, but that has to be our focus where we continue. The world community has to be engaged in that. That's the long-term solution. In the meantime, you do have people who are fleeing terrorism or are fleeing. The folks that I talked to in that refugee camp, most of them had been there 4 or 5 years. I mean, usually you go to a refugee camp, you think you're there for 6 months, and then you go back home when things stabilize. So this has been a long time coming, and when folks do flee, we are a compassionate country. We have always been part of doing our part with the world community, accepting those who are fleeing violence and persecution. And so I think we should do that as long as we have the proper safeguards in place to make sure that we don't endanger our own citizens. But we should step up to that responsibility. But ultimately, we've got to have a long-term solution or this problem will not go away.
One of my favorite stories that I have done recently, in addition to the M-City story, which was a lot of fun to do, but it was one that deals with the reality that we have just discussed, and that is that the United States, any country, is going to have a military, and the military has to be ready. And if they're going to be ready, they need to be well supplied. It is your take, and it was interesting to see right here in our own backyard in Big Rapids that American troops should be wearing products that are made in the United States. And you took a tour up at the Wolverine shoe factory that I had never been through. It was fascinating to watch what they did, how many people are employed. They've almost doubled their employment in the past 18 months or something. Because there is a bill that was implemented that says if you're going to buy footwear, you're going to buy it from American-made or American sources. Tell me about your interest in that and how you'd like to see that expand a little bit.
Well, I think we have to continue to expand that, is the fact that we've got to make sure that as we are equipping our warfighters with the equipment that they need, that it's made in America. You think from a national security perspective, you don't want to think that any of your suppliers are coming from somewhere else, because that supply could be cut off. And in this great country, and we think about our history as a nation and when we've been successful, and coming in Michigan in particular as being the arsenal of democracy in World War II, and using our muscle that we had from a manufacturing perspective, there's no reason why we can't be making the equipment that our men and women who serve have. And that includes things from boots to the athletic footwear that's provided to them as well, to train so that they have the physical readiness necessary to be put into a conflict area. It should be made in America. So that's why I've focused on that. We'll continue to focus on making sure the Department of Defense is using American labor to build the structure that they need to bring us security around the world.
Well, and you talk about the supply line, but you also talk about it as an economic standpoint, because these kind of contracts are keeping some of these manufacturing places really in business and allowing them to also stay in the private sector too, because they've got enough business that they can support themselves. So it becomes, in that case, not just good for American troops, but certainly it's good for all of those people who have jobs in Big Rapids.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point, is because, and if you look at the example of Wolverine, they make other footwear products, from motorcycle manufacturers to other kinds of athletic wear to boat shoes. But the footwear business is a really tough business, and we have significant foreign competition for our footwear coming into this country. But because they have a military contract that allows them, and they know they've got products that they can deliver to the Department of Defense, it changes the business model for them so that they can produce shoes for civilian market as well. If they didn't have the military contract, not only would we lose that, they would also lose the ability to create additional products for the civilian market, and that would mean a lot fewer jobs. So you're absolutely right. It's not just the jobs associated with the military contract. It's all of the other jobs that allow them to hire people to do the other parts of the market.
Our thanks to Senator Peters, and we're back with more To the Point. So another week has passed, and we're that much closer to Decision 2016. It is a week where our new poll shows Hillary Clinton leading in Michigan by 11 points. Another debate tonight could have an impact on those numbers, and the candidate herself, Hillary Clinton, will be in Detroit on Monday. We'll be there for that. And I hope you'll be here next Sunday morning at 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.